Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk you through a lesson plan for teaching the Toulmin model argument. So I start this lesson with an opening. So I'll have had my students read about Toulmin model or watch a video about Toulmin model for homework the night before. And so I start with an opening free write where I ask them to identify and explain one component of the Toulmin model. So there's basically 6 components of the Toulmin model that they've learned about. They're going to identify one of them and give me a definition of it. Explain what that technique or what that element of this approach to argument involves. Then, so typically I have 2 or 3 students read what they've written aloud, but in this case I do something slightly different because I'll put the 6 components up on the board. So we've got the claim, we've got qualifiers, we've got reasons or evidence, we've got warrants, we've got backing, and we've got a rebuttal. Yeah, I think there's 6, but I counted 7 for some reason. I don't know. I don't do math, I'm an English person. And apparently that extends as far as basic counting. But anyway, you put the 6 components of the Toulmin model up on the board. And then I actually give my students a couple more minutes to work with the people around them to come up with definitions for all 6 of these components. Then we talk through them. So I'll have the students give me their definitions. So what is the claim? What are qualifiers? What is reasons or evidence? What's the warrants? What are warrants? What's backing? What's a rebuttal? We put these things up on the board and we talk through them. Like we'll sort of talk more expansively about them than just their definitions. I'll sort of fill in some additional information, provide them some different ways of thinking about these things, especially warrants. We'll talk about stated versus unstated warrants, the difference between what I would call interpretation of evidence, where you're connecting your reasons to the claim, and assumptions that underlie an argument, both of which are parts of warrants. We'll also talk about what I call content qualifiers and linguistic qualifiers. So what I mean by content qualifiers is basically establishing exceptions to the claim. Under these circumstances, this claim might not be true. Or if these conditions aren't met, or if these conditions are met, this might not be true. These are some possible alternatives, etc., etc. But then you've also got linguistic qualifiers, individual words or phrases like many, most, seldom, sometimes, often, in some cases, etc., etc., that signal exceptions. After we've got all of our definitions up on the board, I ask students to look at the Toulmin model as a whole and think about why. Why does this system exist? Or what is this system meant to do? And so that's a potentially very broad question, but the kinds of things that, at least in my experience, students will tend to come up with is it gives you a system for arguing. And it gives you a more sophisticated approach to building an argument structure. So those are really, really good things. Those are absolutely crucial things that the Toulmin model does. And one of the things that I then start to emphasize to them is that the Toulmin model builds in safeguards that try and make it harder for us to make invalid or incorrect arguments, particularly qualifiers and an awareness of warrants, an awareness of the assumptions that underlie the arguments we're making. By thinking carefully about those things, Stephen Toulmin hoped that we would better get to truth with our arguments. So that's something that's really significant about this model and this approach. And that's something I emphasize for my students. The other thing related to that is that the Toulmin model is meant to help us avoid absolutes. And so I ask the students if they can define absolutes. And sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. Often they have a sense of it. And so we talk through what absolutes mean, what absolute arguments mean, and why they're a problem. And I give them an example. The example that I've been going with is Democrats support social spending, or Republicans support Second Amendment rights. Now, the problem with the way that that's phrased is that if I present even one counterexample, then the argument is undercut because it doesn't allow for exceptions. But if I say many Democrats support social spending, or in some cases, Republicans support Second Amendment rights, then I can present a number of counterexamples while still having my fundamental argument be correct, provided I've provided, no, I'm not going to go with that phrase. As long as I have provided sufficient backing, warrants, and reasons. So as long as I have proved my claim that many or most or some or often, then the argument remains valid. So that's the whole sort of lecture portion of this. Then we turn to the reading that the students have done for homework. Now this semester I used an essay called Why It's Crucial to Get More Women into Science by, I think her first name is Marguerite Goodichet. It's in the textbook that we're reading. It's also, I forget where it was published, but it was published, and so it's available online. But that doesn't really matter, because you can use any argument that uses at least most of the components of the Toulmin model. And I had them read that for homework. And then in class, I give them a few minutes to work with the people around them to go through that essay and identify as many components of the Toulmin model as they can find. And after I've given them some time to do that, we go through and we talk about it. So the first thing we talk about is, what's the claim? And in Why It's Crucial to Get More Women into Science, we don't necessarily have a great obvious thesis statement, but we've got a so I let them do a sort of paraphrased claim where they explain, they put in their own words what they think the claim is, but then I also ask them for contenders from within the essay itself for what the claim is. Then we talk about reasons, and that's actually a much easier category. They can find pieces of evidence to support the general claim. And that's what we kind of come down to with this essay is, here's a general claim we can all roughly agree on, and then they can find reasons to support that. Then, so we've talked about claim, we talk about reasons. I ask them then what warrants they identified in this essay. So either where do we see interpretation connecting the reasons to the claim, or what kinds of assumptions has this author made? And we talk about some of those. Then we skip backing, because backing is a little bit trickier sometimes, especially if they haven't done a great job identifying warrants, which is sometimes tough to do. So then we talk about rebuttal. Is there a rebuttal? What is it? What purpose does it serve in this particular essay, etc., etc.? And then finally, I actually take them back to qualifiers. So in particular, how does this author set content limits on this argument? How do they sort of allow for exceptions or acknowledge that there are certain circumstances under which their argument may not be correct? We don't necessarily focus that much on linguistic qualifiers because they're individual words and phrases and things like that, and they're fairly easy to go through and just find anyway in most essays. So I don't devote a ton of time to talking about that, but I do point out to students that that's another component of this essay. So this is essentially what we end up with, is a system where we're defining the components of the Toulmin model, figuring out why the Toulmin model is important, and then we're looking at it in a sample essay to see how it functions for real writers.